Hello and welcome back to the Gem Hawks YouTube channel. I hope that no matter what it is you're doing today, it is a beautiful day for you. I'd like to share with you a design today which I've been refining over the past couple of weeks, and full disclosure, I've been through a lot of wire to get this to a stage that I think is suitable for beginners to work with. Now, I've been asked quite a lot recently about designs that are really non-gender specific. Primarily I've been asked to create more gentlemanly designs, but what I'd like to do is to create some jewellery which is perhaps just a little bit less feminine, suitable for absolutely anybody to wear. So the design I'm going to share with you today can be a bangle, or it could be a bar segment inside a chain bracelet perhaps. If you'd like to join me down at the board, I'll show you the piece that I've come up with and wish to share with you now. So it does contain beads. These are faceted. You could definitely go for non-faceted beads. I've chosen to work with 7mm black agate rounds, but you can use whatever you want, really within reason. Very chunky jewellery on the wrist. I find a little bit uncomfortable, but I would say anywhere between 4 and 8mm is absolutely perfect. It does need to be a round for the design to work most beautifully. You could play around with the design if you wanted to with other bead shapes. We're going to be working with 3 gauges of wire today. Now the core wire is going to be a little bit heavier. So basically you need to check that your beads are going to fit on a slightly heavier core wire. It makes a much more substantial piece of wire jewellery. Looking at it end on, or face up rather, you can see that we've got quite an attractive finish to the design. It looks very machined, very regular. I've made both a bangle which connects back into itself just using a basic wrapped loop and hook assembly. But I've also made a very diminutive piece which is attached to a length of handmade chain. And this has just got a wrapped loop on either end. I've got some little bits of chain that we can add on later to create a complete piece. If you wanted to make it as the bangle, it's just a case of one end will be a wrapped loop anyway, and the other end you could turn into a hook if you wished to. So in terms of the materials, we're going to be working with 1.25mm wire. We're also going to be working with 1mm gauge wire, which is equivalent to 18, so 16 and 18 gauge wire. And also off the reel, some 0.5, which is a bit of a funny one, or 24 gauge wire. I'm going to be working with that off the reel. I'll tell you the lengths as we get to the relevant points. The beads that I've chosen to work with are these 7mm round black faceted agates, purely because I love how a shiny black bead looks with copper, especially when the copper starts to age. I'm working with raw copper round wire just because it's probably my favourite wire in the world to work with, even more than sterling silver. So I'm going to pop the beads out of the way for a second before I knock them onto the floor. Basic beads, tools today rather, are your bent chain nose, flush cutters, and I've got a second pair of chain nose pliers just in case you want some help wrapping on those wrapped loop or those ends. It just makes life just a little bit easier. Now if you wanted to make a bangle that is suitable for a 6.5 inch wrist, I would allow at least 11 to 12 inches of wire. If you want to make it for a much larger wrist, then you'll need to up the amount of wire. So let's say that you're working for an 8-inch wrist. I would recommend at least 17 inches of that core wire. So you've got plenty to work with for those end sections, so you can decide later what you want to do. Because I'm making this as a demonstration piece, I'm working with a short 6-inch length of that 1.25 or 16 gauge wire, and that will be enough for the piece we're going to make together today, which is a bar section to sit in the centre of some chain. So let's just pop that back out of the way, and we'll start with a wrapped loop at one end. As ever, you can use any round nose pliers or some bail making pliers if you prefer to help you with those nice smooth shapes. I'm just going to turn a right angle around about 1.25 inches from one end. If you want to have more strength in the segment at the end, In this case, this is a hoop shape. Let's just open that out. Just a little wrapped loop. Allow slightly more before that bend, up to 2.5 inches even, and you'll get more turns around that core wire. So if you are making for a very large wrist, I'd allow a little bit more so that you can get some more turns in there at the end. Let's just pop that in the corner. So I'm going to use my 2-step bail makers to rotate that end wire around. I'm starting a little way down before rotating that around so that we get that shepherd's crook shape. Pop those bail makers back in. You could be using your round nose pliers and finish that design off. So I'm making really an oversized wrapped loop because it's just easier for you to see. Once I'm happy with the roundness of that loop and also the fact that it is very centralized on the end of the section of wire, I'm going to hold that into position carefully whilst I bring the tail around. Now when you're working with a heavier core wire like this 16 gauge or 1.25mm, it may hurt your little fingertips, so I'm going to take a second pair of pliers to draw that coil of wire around the central core. It's obviously much easier to do when you don't have to keep it in a funny orientation to show it on a camera. So I'm just going to grip and rotate, and that just smooths the end away. We've got ourselves a basic wrapped loop. This is obviously quite a large one, just so that you can see what's happening here. The next thing we're going to do is to take our length of the 1mm wire. Now this is around about 12 inches or so in length. I'm just going to trim that down slightly because it was overly long. I'm working with around 12 inches here, and that will give us this small bar section. If you wanted to make a 6.5 inch bangle like this, I would recommend around 24 inches of wire to work with to give you plenty to create these swooshing shapes around those beads. And again, for instance, if you were making up into a very large bangle, you would need to up the length of your 1mm or 18 gauge wire accordingly. So if you're making an 8-inch bangle, probably 30 inches or so. You can always find uses for those offcuts. What we're going to do now is just make sure that the whole length of that wire is reasonably smooth. So I'm going to grip a hold of one end, just pull that between thumb and forefinger so that it's smooth. We're going to find the dead centre of the wire, and we're going to lay that over the nicest face on our wrapped loop. So this would be the face that sits upwards on the wrist or wherever abouts you position that. So I'd like to say that this is slightly less pretty, and then this is the slightly prettier one. So you could, if you wanted to, just rotate that wire around a little bit more, or you could even turn the loop if you wanted to. We're in the middle of our supplementary wire, which is 1mm 18 gauge, and I'm just going to hold that centre point over the top of our core wire. This is indeed the trickiest part about this whole design, getting this first coil neatly. So what I'm going to do is just slightly move it along so there's just a tiny bit more on the right hand side, and then I'm going to draw that all the way around the core wire and back exactly where it was a second ago, having completed one circuit. Now we don't need it to be so tight that it grips, but we need it to be tidy. So I'm just going to pop in with those bent chain nose pliers and make sure that I'm happy with that loop that we've created. So we've just looped the centre of our lighter wire around the very, very top bit of that core wire, hard up against the wrapped loop coils that we've just created. When choosing your beads, it is ideal to find large drill hole beads, purely because you can work then with a stronger core wire. I've chosen to work with that 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire because it makes a really substantial bangle, or a really substantial bar if you're making to add to chain. Just means that you can form it into the curvature for the back of the wrist, and it's not going to be a bit flim-flammy, which your 1mm or 18 gauge may be. So choose your beads carefully and make sure that they are going to be able to go on that heavier core wire. So before I add in my first bead, I want to start winding on my 3rd gauge of wire. Now this is slightly heavier than my normal weaving wire. I usually use a 0.4mm, which is equivalent to 26 gauge, but I've decided to move to a 0.5mm. Again, I'm demonstrating with round raw copper wire. It's my favourite copper, it's my favourite wire to work with. And I'm working directly off the reel for this. Now I've got a limited amount left on this spool, so hopefully we'll have enough to do a few demonstrations of this technique. The first thing I'm going to do is wrap 3 times around that core wire after where we've added that mid gauge. So you can be quite thrifty and just pinch the very end over, wrap that around twice, and then reassess the situation. Everything will obviously move around for the time being. It will become steady very, very soon. And I'm just going to take that very end around until it sits neatly. If you end up with more than 3 wraps, you can either trim away that little excess, or you can unspool it slightly once it's in position. I think we'll be just about right when we get there. So again, I'm keeping the up face, my preferred side of that wrapped loop. And also we're ending the finest gauge, the 0.5 or 24 gauge wire, tidily away so it's not visible from the top. I'm just going to put a little tiny bit of warmth and heat into my core wire to make sure that it is as smooth and as straight as I can get it. Once all the beads are loaded, you won't be able to put any heat into it, so we want it to have some flexibility at this stage. I'm going to add on a bead at the end and just slide that up into position. So my drill holes are just large enough, it's just that there's a little bit of a kink at the end of that wire which I didn't address before the tutorial. So I'm just going to address that now, straightening up that end section like so. So my bead is in position. What I need to do now is take the finer gauge wire directly underneath the bead. Now that will become obvious why later. So the finer gauge wire is presently coming in the direction towards the bottom of the screen from the top of the coil. So we're going to take that directly underneath the bead to the upper side of the core wire, and I'm going to pull that firmly and wrap 3 times. So that's 1 and 2 and 3 before just pointing that down for a second. So the reason will become apparent later as to why we've wrapped that finer gauge wire underneath the bead. It doesn't stay there at the end, we'll move it around, because otherwise, if you don't, it can be a little bit scratchy on the back of the skin. It's still a smooth round wire, but if you have touch sensitivity like I do, then you might not enjoy that. So the next thing we're going to do is to pick one of these wires. We've got a lower and an upper wire that are connected onto that core by a single wrap. What I need to do is hold the whole assembly in position, warm the lower wire. The reason I'm going for the lower wire first is because it's closer to the wrapped loop. So this one needs to move first. The one that is in second position, so you've got position 1 and position 2 if you like. So the first one, which is closest to the wrapped loop, just needs to circle over the top of the design like so. So the first one is a slightly different shape to the rest of them, and it needs to just loop very, very smoothly. We warmed the wire so it's nice and smooth. And what I'm going to do is go over the top with my bent chain nose pliers and pick that wire just before it intersects the core and put a sharp bend so that it follows the same course as that core wire. You can give that a bit of a smooth if you need to. Now again, we're going to warm this wire up at the top. This is the position 2 wire. I'm going to give that a little bit of a heat before I push down again, holding the whole assembly into position, making sure that all of those coils are nice and neat and tidy, and then draw that wire over the face of the design. You may need to support the lower of your 2 wires. And again, where it intersects with the core wire, just before that point, we're going to turn a nice angle and then draw the tail of wire away so that it sits side by side. Our core wire is always in the centre, and our wires don't cross over. They sit side by side. So do you remember we had that little lighter gauge wire underneath? We need to continue rotating that around in the same direction. So it was going over the top of the core wire and in this direction. So we've got to copy that direction. I'm going to bring that around once, pinching my core wire, my upper wire and my lower wire into position. Pinch them really firmly whilst rotating around 3 times. And then we're just going to leave that underneath going in the direction it would have gone anyway. It's always going to be moving in the same direction now. I'm going to take those 3 wraps and give them a little, very gentle squish before pulling firmly up and away. My upper wire goes up, my lower wire goes down. I'm just going to retighten those 3 little wraps, give them nice but firm squish to make sure that they become a band, so that they're nicely banded around that collection of wires. Then I'm going to bring the tail of this finer gauge wire up between the core and the upper wire, and then rotate 3 times around that core. 2 and 3. And then what we're going to do is tighten everything up and make sure that all of our little rotations are neat and tidy. Push that coil of wire as firmly as you can up towards the banding that we've created around all 3 pieces. What will happen if you use a core wire, which is the 1mm or 18 gauge, this will all go flompy. It will all come out of position. Flompy is probably not a technical word. What you can do is just address these angles slightly if you wish to. I'm going to pull these just very, very gently a little bit further away. My core wire has been wrapped with the finer wire, and that's running away over to the top slightly from underneath. The next thing we're going to do is add in our next bead. So again, drill holes are super important. You check that they go on your wire first. Now, which one comes first? At this stage, it doesn't matter. It's only on that first move, really, that you don't even need to think about it, to be honest, if you've done it the other way around. It simply doesn't matter. The wires aren't crossing over at any point. What we do need to do is pinch them very firmly whilst you make that swoosh. So we've just drawn the tail of the wire over. Just before it intersects that core wire, we're going to grip a hold of it. You could lift it if you wanted to make your life slightly easier. Put a lovely angle on it so that it sits parallel to that core but doesn't cross over. Again, I'm going to pinch the bead and the whole assembly to draw the wire around. I'm using the bead to enable that shape in the wire. Where it transects that core wire, again, we're going to put that angle in so that it then runs parallel. The upper wire runs above, the lower wire runs below. Before we start anything else, what we need to do is draw the tail of wire that's connected to the reel underneath. I'm just going to flip the design over so that you can see what's happening with this wire at the back. It needs to pass from one side to the other. So we're going to draw that across the back of the bead. You can see the finer gauge wire is currently on top of the design as we're looking at it right now. So it needs to travel underneath the bead and sit on the underside of the core. So it's switching sides. I'm then going to turn the design over and we're going to wrap 3 times around just that core wire nice and neatly. 1, 2 and 3 before giving that a bit of a squish. Now you could, if you wanted to, use a ring clamp to help you keep these side by side whilst you apply the banding. I don't think it's necessary, honestly, because the wire in the centre is heavier and you can use that heaviness to allow you a neatness of wrapping. So I've just got the reel is just getting a little bit feisty, so we're going to wrap this now 3 times around all 3 wires. Now I've done my first wrap and what I've noticed is there's a bit of air space. I don't want that, so I'm just going to push those wires until they sit much more neatly together. You can open them up at the side as they come further away. I'm just going to push those very carefully. That's much more neat and that's what we want. We want a machined aspect. So again, I've done my 3 little wraps. I'm going to bring that tail of wire away in the direction it's travelling. Scooch up those 3 little wraps. Now if you make sure that those wires are all side by side on the back, that's what I mean, side by side, not crossing over, side by side, flip them over. You can give that a hearty little squish and a neaten, and a squish and a neaten before you pull the upper wire up and away, the lower wire down and away. And then we're going to wrap, you've guessed it, 3 times around that core. So that's 1, that's 2, that's 3. Allow the wire to just sit out of the way whilst you neaten up your wraps. Now you can see there's a bit of a gap in the banding just here. So to fix that, I'm going to put one side of my pliers top right, the other side of my pliers bottom left, and just tighten that up until it sits just a little bit more neatly. Once it gets into a happy position for you, you can give that another squish and a squeeze, have to come in from an alien angle. There we go. And then you've set that second bead into position. I'm going to show you the addition of one more bead before I show you how to finish up and complete with a wrapped loop. So I'm going to come in with my last bead. Imagine you have completed a full bangle. I'll show you what wrapping the wire underneath the bead looks like without the wires on either side getting in the way. So it's just coming from one side of the core wire to the other across the underneath of that bead. So 1 and 2 and 3 really firm wraps. Turn it back over. Allow the wire to sit down out of the way. Give that a bit of a scooch up so everything's super neat and tidy. And then we're going to bring those 2 wires back and round. Now, if you want to finish off in symmetry, you can choose to either go for a symmetrical look, in so much as if you wanted it to be symmetrical, the wire that we're looking at that goes over the top finishes closer to the beads, and the wire that we're looking at underneath finishes closest to the wrapped loop. If you don't want to get into that at all, it doesn't matter one little bit. When you do get to the end, and I would suggest using a nice full reel of that 0.5mm gauge. It doesn't use huge acres of it, but we've almost burnt through the remainder of this reel. So what I'm going to do is flip the design over and make sure that we truncate super neatly the finest wire, which is the 0.5. Always look twice, and then you won't have to sob into your coffee. I'm just going to take that tail and smooth it down so that it doesn't get tangled up with anything. Flip that back over to the other side. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose to go for symmetry rather than moving through. If you were moving through the design, you'd probably want this wire, which is underneath at the present, because it came closest from the wrapped loop. You might want to finish that one first, whichever is your aesthetic pleasure. So I'm going to take the tail of the wire that's coming over the top, give that a lovely, lovely warm. I'm going to pinch the whole thing into position, and I'm just going to wrap that around the core one time only. Trim away at the underneath before we give that a really good squish and a squeeze. So we had worked with around about 12 inches of wire, so there's 1, 2, 3 inches here. There'll be another 2 or 3 inches from the other side in just a moment, and that would have done another probably 2 beads. So a 5 bead bar assembly, I made a 3 bead bar assembly, would have taken that sort of 12 inches of the finer wire. So I'm going to bring in now the second, or the underneath wire, give that a really lovely warm through first, allow it to swoop around underneath, and then grip that firmly. Let's get my pliers out of the way, and then we're just going to rotate that around one time just after the other wrap occurred. So I just need to tighten that coil slightly and draw that cross so that it sits neatly. So I'm just going to flip the design over. Take the tail nice and short, that almost went into infinity and beyond, and then just squish down those very end sections, tidy those coils up as much as you possibly can. Now, if you were wanting to make a hook assembly here, you could very, very simply just make a right angle down, a curved shape, like so. This is how a hook assembly would work. You just come down a little bit, go round in a circular form, and then finish with a little kickback, making sure that it does indeed fit through your wrapped loop. So that's the form that you would take just here, bearing in mind that that's the underside and that's our pretty side, so the bend will need to come down towards the slightly less pretty side where those crosses of wire are. If you want to make a bar segment for the middle of a chain bracelet, I'm just going to show you how to finish off with a wrapped loop now. So just making sure that everything's neat and tidy. I'm going to grip a hold of the wire and make a sideways bend so that the wrapped loops are in the same orientation on either end. Again, you can make a 2-move wrapped loop, or you can just rotate all the way around and bring that circular form. Make sure that it's sitting centrally. And we're just going to fill the gap that we have on the core wire. So that naked bit just needs to be filled up with a few turns. Give that a bit of a squish and a squeeze. So this section we started with was around about 6 inches for our demonstration piece, and that has very neatly just given us enough to do 3 beads. So if you wanted to do 5 beads, you would need to take that up a little bit further. For me, I think the 3 bead bar assembly for a chain bracelet is probably just right, but that's because I'm working with 7mm beads. If your beads are smaller, then you can get more of them on there. So to add this into some chain, I'm just going to apply some shaping. The benefit of using that heavier gauge core wire means that once you put this into shape, it's much more likely to stay in shape. Now before we add those bits of chain, and I'm just going to demonstrate using some jump rings and some scraps of chain that I have. When I made this segment, I created the chain and added it into those end wrapped loops, which makes for a much stronger, I don't know what the word stronger means, but we're not having any of it today. I will just show you on the back how to move those segments of wire over so that you have a comfort fit design. I'm using my nail because I'm a jeweller and they don't matter to me very much, and I'm just pushing those wires over until they sit underneath the swooping wires around the side. In that way you have a slightly greater level of comfort. Now if you're working with different beads, you'll obviously get a different aesthetic. You can make this as masculine or feminine or any other kind of way you like. That's the bead bar assembly. And that's what it looks like with some handmade chain in position. You could, like I say, create your very own J-hook with the residue of wire that comes through. It's a nice strong wire. Once you've created that J shape, what I tend to do is give that a really lovely squishing with the pliers, or grab a hammer and a block and just very, very gently hammer, just gently, the very, very end section and only where it sits flat. I'm just going to open up one of these brass jump rings, give that a bit of a squish and a squeeze, pop that into the central bar that we created together and add in a piece of chain, and job is done. You've created a section. These aren't actually my favourite jump rings, I'm not going to lie. My preference would be to create the bead bar assembly by wrapping your initial wrapped loops into the chain as we go, but I didn't want to detract from the tutorial. So that's basically how you create your unisex banded bar bracelet assembly. And if you wanted to make a J-hook to make it a single open and close bangle, that's the technique there. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope that you've enjoyed this as much as I have. I did burn through acres and acres of wire. Yeah, you don't measure wire in acres, you measure it in meters, yards or feet, but there were multiples of them that I burnt through to try and make this as accessible as possible to absolute beginners. I love the finish, and I love that there's no coils and swells on it. It's not super feminine, it's suitable for absolutely anyone. I like faceted black agate. I don't think it's super feminine, but it's what I had, and I love how it looks with copper, and it shows up on the camera really nicely. So I hope that you've enjoyed the tutorial. Any other requests, just leave me a comment below. It's been my pleasure to be with you today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.